entrepreneurs and corporations, and we all know recessions are put in the rearview mirror when you have the capability to build confidence in the future and make investments. And let me quickly say, for our company, we plan to invest $25 billion in infrastructure over the next 5 years. It is critical we know the rules of the road of climate change as soon as possible to make sure that we are making the right investments. Regulatory uncertainty is postponing investments in renewables and other green technologies. It's postponing the creation of jobs, from apprentices to engineers to PhDs. Our one fear, and I will leave this with you, is that many in Congress will look for reasons to postpone action on climate legislation this year. As a former consumer advocate who fought rate increases of utility companies in the 70s, I believe by starting now, we have a better chance to smooth out and minimize the inevitable cost increases that will be imposed on U.S. consumers. We have important provisions in this blueprint that mitigate the cost impact on electric consumers while achieving President-elect Obama's stated objective to reduce carbon emissions by 2020. Thank you, Chairman Waxman and the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Ms. Beinecke?
Thank you very much.
There's a button on the base.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank
Good.
you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and all members of the committee for being here today and hearing the recommendations of USCAP. I'm Frances Beinecke, President of the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I want to congratulate you for devoting the first hearing, Chairman Waxman, of your chairmanship to addressing global warming. You are demonstrating that you share our understanding of the urgency of enacting comprehensive legislation to cut global warming pollution. The scientific basis for prompt action has become even more compelling in the 2 years since USCAP issued its call for action. The Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issues its most definitive report, and even more recent findings show that global warming is occurring at a pace that equals or exceeds the upper bounds of earlier predictions. We see this in higher global temperatures, in the shrinking Arctic ice sheet, in the increasing acidification of the oceans, and increasing sea level rise. Global warming is no longer a distant threat, but a present danger to public health, to national security, to biodiversity, to the planet. Some will suggest that the current economic crisis is a reason to delay comprehensive climate legislation. I believe that the opposite is true. The work this committee has already started on economic stimulus legislation can jumpstart investments in clean energy infrastructure and help get our economy back on track. These public investments will leverage much more private spending and will be far more effective if Congress follows the economic stimulus bill by promptly enacting legislation that establishes a clear roadmap for achieving the 80% reduction in global warming pollution that's needed by mid-century. The targets during the first decade of the program are among the most important and most challenging of a bill's design features. Since the U.S. is late in cutting emissions, we need to make up for lost time. But some stakeholders are concerned about the cost and feasibility of meeting deep emission reduction targets, particularly in the early years. This tension has led to a range of views on the appropriate near-term targets. In the blueprint, USCAP recommends emission limits for cap sources and for total U.S. emissions that would be equivalent to an 80% reduction by 2050, nearly 50% reduction by 2030, and a range of 14 to 20% reduction by 2020. It's important to stress that these targets are tightly linked to the other recommendations included in the blueprint, as will be described by my colleagues. I'd also like to be clear that NRDC believes that the science justifies a reduction of at least 20% by 2020. We joined the USCAP consensus because we believe it is critical to enact climate legislation this year, and we believe that the blueprint shows a way to marshal the support from diverse constituencies needed to achieve that goal. Mr. Chairman and all members of the committee, we have a short window of opportunity to enact effective global warming legislation and secure our physical, economic, and environmental future. We look forward to working with all of you to achieve that in the coming year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Beinecke. Mr. Krupp.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm honored to be here. This blueprint for climate security is a blueprint because it has a cap that protects the atmosphere. The cap is the legal guarantee that pollution actually goes down. But the cap does a lot more than that. The cap creates customers. And if America has ever needed customers at home and abroad, both for new and existing technologies, now is that time. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your commitment to move legislation out of this committee by the Memorial Day recess. For the sake of our atmosphere and our economy, we really need Congress to enact this legislation this year. My role is to talk about cost control measures, the most powerful of which is the cap-and-trade program itself. Cap-and-trade creates competition that will drive costs down while amplifying the effect of any stimulus package that you pass. These measures, other measures will also be needed, and these measures should protect the economy, drive investment in energy efficiency, and maintain the environmental integrity of the overall emissions budget. Emissions offset, that is, activities that reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are not included in sectors that are not part of the cap, are a critical cost control measure recommended in the USCAP blueprint. Since USCAP is recommending stringent emissions targets, we also recommend the generous use of offsets to help moderate the compliance costs. USCAP recommends that Congress establish a board to set an overall annual upper limit for offsets, starting at 2 billion metric tons, with the authority to increase offsets up to 3 billion metric tons. Since the quality of offsets is as important as the quantity, we also recommend that Congress direct EPA to establish a rigorous and transparent process for ensuring that all offsets represent real and additional reductions. In addition, the board should oversee system-wide strategic offset and allowance pool, a carbon board, which includes a reserve pool with additional offsets and, as a measure of last resort, the ability to borrow from future compliance periods that could be released into the market to prevent undue economic harm if necessary. Quality forest carbon tons created by reducing tropical deforestation would be eligible both for the international offset portion and for this strategic offset reserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Krupp. Ms. Clausen.
Chairman Waxman, Ranking Member Barton, members of the committee, my name is Eileen Clausen, and I'm the president of the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. I'm going to say a few words about USCAP's recommendations regarding the allocation of allowance value. Greenhouse gas emission allowances in an economy-wide cap-and-trade system will represent trillions of dollars in value over the life of the program. USCAP believes the distribution of allowance value should facilitate the transition to a low-carbon economy for consumers and businesses, provide capital to support new low and zero greenhouse gas emitting technologies, and address the need for humans and the environment to adapt to climate change. USCAP recommends that a significant portion of allowances should be initially distributed free to capped entities and economic sectors particularly disadvantaged by the secondary price effects of a cap, and that free distribution of allowances be phased out over time. The USCAP blueprint identifies principles to guide the fair and equitable allocation of allowances to end-use consumers of electricity, natural gas, and transportation fuels, low-income consumers and workers in transition, energy-intensive industries that face international competition, trade-exposed commodity products, competitive power generators and other non-utility large stationary sources, programs to achieve technology transformation, and adaptation needs of vulnerable people and ecosystems at home and abroad. One of our main objectives is to dampen the price impact of climate policy on the customers of electricity and natural gas, particularly in the early years of the emissions constraint. And therefore, we believe that a significant portion of emission allowance value should also be allocated to electric and natural gas local distribution companies, which are cost regulated and where the price alleviation would be passed on to consumers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Clausen. Our next witness to testify is Mr. Darby from PG&E.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Barton, other members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. I'm going to address the issue of energy efficiency, one of my favorite. From virtually every angle, be it cost or technology or the size and value of the benefits, one of the best strategies to attack the climate problem is improving our energy efficiency. As Time magazine said in a recent cover story, it's perfectly clean, remarkably cheap, surprisingly abundant, and immediately available. Its cost is about 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour, which I think is as cheap or cheaper than any alternative energy source. USCAP heartily seconds the appraisal of Time magazine. Fortunately, for 30 years, PG&E has designed and run some of the world's most effective energy efficiency initiatives. This success is just one of the many indicators pointing to the enormous benefits available nationally in this field. In USCAP's view, these include not only lower energy emissions, but also economic investment, jobs, and not the least, savings for our customers. The key lies in the right mix of policies, programs, and incentives. With that as the goal, USCAP's specific recommendations are the following: setting or updating codes and standards for buildings and end-use technologies at the federal and state levels, including improving efficiency in federal buildings; expanding tax credits, incentives, and rebates for buildings that outperform energy efficiency codes; fully funding energy efficiency outreach and education; providing incentives to manufacturers and retailers who embrace highly efficient equipment and appliances; using tax and regulatory policies to drive consumers and manufacturers towards more energy efficiency products and processes; developing a generally accepted approach for measuring and tracking energy reductions and corresponding emissions benefits; encouraging state regulators to align policies so that utilities are incentivized to put a high priority on energy efficiency and demand management. A prime example of this is revenue decoupling, which eliminates the incentives for utilities to sell more energy as they are currently motivated to do today; tracking and reporting state progress on energy efficiency, potentially rewarding the leaders with additional energy efficiency funding; and finally, labeling buildings to provide information on the value of energy savings and requiring that information be factored into loan applications and underwriting. Together, we believe these steps would jumpstart major progress towards boosting the overall energy efficiency of the U.S. economy. Thank you for this opportunity to speak before you.
Thank you, Mr. Darby. Now we'll hear from Mr. Chiaro from Rio Tinto. There's a button on the base. Yep.
Chairman Waxman, Ranking Member Barton, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for agreeing to listen to our views this morning. I am Preston Chiaro, Chief Executive Energy and Minerals for Rio Tinto. We're a major minerals and metals producer with operations and markets worldwide. Here in the U.S., we're the second largest coal producer, and we're also the world's second largest producer of uranium for nuclear power generation. Our coal and uranium together provide the fuel for about 9% of the nation's electricity generation. Our U.S. businesses employ over 15,000 people in 31 states, with major operations in California, Kentucky, Utah, and Wyoming. I want to talk this morning about technology. Many low greenhouse gas emitting technologies already exist, and these technologies will be important for near-term reductions. But we must also develop the long-term critical path solutions that will allow us to meet aggressive reduction targets over time. Critical path technologies such as carbon dioxide capture and storage, or CCS, need stable, predictable funding sources not subject to annual appropriations in order to compress and accelerate the technology deployment and commercialization timeframes. CCS really is a key enabling technology to unlock an environmentally friendly future for fossil fuels. The proposals outlined in the blueprint are intended to promote CCS technologies to levels above and beyond what a CO2 market price signal alone will yield. Our specific specific recommendations include, first, by 2010, a comprehensive national strategy for implementing all necessary rules and removing legal barriers for CCS deployment. Second, funding for 5 gigawatts of projects to demonstrate full integration and viability of CCS with power production and other industrial processes. Demonstration projects must be underway even before a cap-and-trade program is in place. Third, direct funding of CCS projects for sequestered CO2 from coal and other fossil fuels made on a first-come, first-served basis. Funding levels must be adequate to cover the incremental costs of capturing and storing CO2 instead of emitting it into the atmosphere, and sufficient to encourage deployment on the order of about 72 gigawatts. We believe this will keep coal in the overall generation mix and avoid a costly dash to gas within the power sector. Once an adequate regulatory framework and financial incentives are in place, and CCS technology has been successfully deployed in commercial settings, we recommend that all new coal plants meet a reasonable performance standard. We believe that these policy recommendations will go far in ensuring that coal remains a cornerstone of electricity generation in the future while responding to the imperative to reduce man-made greenhouse gases. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chiaro. And finally, we'll hear from Mr. Mulva from ConocoPhillips.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee members. As Chairman of ConocoPhillips, the third largest U.S.-based integrated energy company, we support the integrated set of recommendations included in USCAP's blueprint for legislative action. Greenhouse gas emissions from transportation fuel represent nearly 1/3 of U.S. total. Clearly, this sector must be covered by any comprehensive national policy. However, reducing these end-use emissions, it's going to be complicated. It will require a systematic approach that involves fuel providers, vehicle and equipment manufacturers, consumers, public officials, and policymakers. Now, the blueprint offers several key recommendations specific to transportation. First, emissions from transportation should be included in an economy-wide cap. Second, fuel providers should be responsible for securing allowances for the resulting consumer emissions. And third, coordinated performance measures should be established for all factors involved, and that is vehicles, fuels, and consumers. Including transportation within the cap will provide the environmental certainty that's needed. It will encourage efficiency, technological progress, and more energy-conscious consumer practices. Recommended performance measures include, 1, a greenhouse gas-based fuel performance standard that's challenging, but it's also economically and technically feasible. 2, improved vehicle emission standards. And 3, strong policies that would reduce emissions from travel, stimulate investments in efficiency, and encourage less carbon-intensive infrastructure development. These measures should be periodically reviewed and updated for their effectiveness. Our company and other USCAP members are committed to working with Congress and the new administration. We urge you to enact legislation that effectively protects the climate while also assuring the safe, secure, and affordable energy supplies that sustain our economy and standard of living. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I note that these were the members of your group selected to give oral statements, but we have written statements from the rest of you, and those will certainly be in the record. I want to start off the questioning by yielding to Mr. Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. This is a question to the CEOs. You've heard the concern that adopting the kind of proposal that you're putting before us today could harm your companies. I'm going to ask each one of the CEOs, do you agree with that suggestion or do you disagree? Mr. Mulver, I just need a yes or no because I have several questions. Mr. Mulver.
No, I don't believe that what we are proposing will harm our company and its long-term prospects for opportunities and investment.
Thank you. Mr. Nolan.
I also don't believe it will hurt our company and will make it better in the long term.
Mr. Rowe.
No, sir.
Mr. Crane. No. Mr. Charo?
No, sir.
Mr. Emelt?
Nope.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers?
No, with respect to our company as well as
I'm coming
our
back to you
customers.
with another question. Thank you. Mr. Darby?
No, sir.
Mr. Sturber? Oh, Mr. Tursak, I'm sorry. Okay, great. Mr. Sturba? Okay, great. And let me go to you now, Mr. Rogers. You say that the current economic downturn actually provides Congress with its best opportunity to pass meaningful and sustainable climate legislation. Could you briefly expand on that?
Sure. Because as I study many of the proposals for the economic stimulus, and I look at sort of the green stimulus that's embedded in that, if that is passed, and we have climate legislation passed this year where the economic impact won't be immediate because of the way the plan works, I think the combination of the two together provides the kind of roadmap that will allow companies like ours to start making the decision. And let me also be very blunt about this. I don't think it's going to be cheap or easy to achieve the objectives in the blueprint, and the sooner we get started, the better. And quite frankly, I believe having a debate about this in the middle of the recession is the right time to debate it because economic considerations will be carefully taken into account.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Mr. Chiaro, you represent the second largest coal producer in the United States.
Yes.
And yet in your testimony you say that legislation could encourage innovation, enhance America's energy security, foster economic growth, and improve our balance of trade. Could you briefly expand on that?
Coal has some fundamental characteristics that I believe make it a viable and, in fact, essential fuel for the future. Like every other fuel source, it has environmental aspects that must be controlled. We've done a good job controlling particulate emissions from coal, sulfur dioxide emissions from coal, other aspects of coal mining and so on. And this is just simply the next step in that procession of technology development to produce a technology, carbon capture and storage, that can address the CO2 emissions from coal-fired generation.
Thank you, Mr. Chiaro. Mr. Crane, you say in your testimony that addressing climate legislation is the paramount challenge facing our generation, and that it is a moral imperative that we act without any further delay. Please expand.
I think just from our perspective, our role as business leaders is to target our companies as to the social and economic dynamics in which we live, and this is the most compelling one. And as a major carbon emitter and someone who stands ready with capital to invest in green technologies, what we really need is to work hand in hand with yourselves to provide clarity so we know where to invest.
Thank you. Mr. Emelt, you testify that your wind turbine business has grown from $300 million to $6 billion in just 6 years. And you also state that GE's clean tech eco-imagination business is growing at 20% a year and will soon reach $25 billion and create tens of thousands of jobs. So you see this as a great economic opportunity for GE, huh?
Sir, I believe not just in the United States but globally, the interest in clean technology is high. We see demand for these products on a global basis. And most importantly, we're a net exporter of all these products out of the United States. So I think that investing in clean technology and innovation in clean technology is a great business proposition for many companies in this country.
Thank you. And Ms. Beinecke, you say that the cost of inaction is very high for our economy and for our country. Could you please expand?
Well, the evidence, the scientific evidence of what the consequences of global warming are just mounting very, very rapidly, as I indicated. And so there will be not only severe ecological consequences, but severe humanitarian consequences as a result of that. And so every day that we delay in enacting climate legislation and getting on the path to reducing our carbon emissions puts not only all of our ecological systems at risk, but puts literally hundreds of millions of people around the world at risk for not being able to have secure futures.
Well, Chairman Waxman and I are committed to acting to deal with this urgent problem and to do so in a fashion that represents the urgency of the problem. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. Mr. Blunt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we put this or other things into legislation, we'll of course have to come up always with cost estimates, with economic impact estimates. Ms. Clausen, are there those estimates in the report?
No, we do not have them in the blueprint. We have done some economic modeling, and we have looked very carefully at the economic modeling that's been done over the last year on pieces of legislation like the Lieberman-Warner bill. It is our conclusion that you cannot derive point estimates that are meaningful here, but you can get a lot of insights. And we took those insights into account when we developed the blueprint. For example,
let me ask a couple of questions about that. They're not here yet. We'll need to look for them. Lieberman-Warner was the plan that was discussed last year, and the estimates from the Energy Information Administration, from EPA, from the National Association of Manufacturers, they all had estimates that showed significant gross domestic product reductions by 2030. I know in my state alone, in Missouri, the estimate of one of those reports was that we would have a net loss of 57,000 to 76,000 jobs. Obviously not a loss that we would want to have at any time, and particularly not at this time. I'm wondering, Mr. Darby, as you looked at this topic, how much of that is offset by new jobs, and what's in this report that doesn't create the 140% increase in gas prices by 2050, for instance, that Warner Lieberman was purported to increase? Mr. Darby?
Well, Congressman, let me say that there were a lot of concerns when we started on the energy efficiency route 30 years ago in California along the same lines. And people felt that really working hard on energy efficiency as well as choosing the route on renewables that we did would hurt the economy, and yet the California economy has grown better than average in the United States over that 30-year period. So as we look at it, there are tremendous opportunities with respect to investments in energy efficiency, in investments in renewable technology. You've heard from the CEO of GE about the opportunities there. So I think there will be many puts and takes. Some estimates have indicated that the cost would be below 1% of GNP. Those costs are not insubstantial, but when one thinks about the consequences of inaction, just for example, in water in the west or hurricane damage in the east, they more than swamp the costs associated with dealing with climate change. And what we've learned from business is the sooner you start working on a major problem, the more degrees of freedom that you have in solving that, and the solutions are cheaper. So the costs will not be inconsequential, but they will be less than the cost of inaction.
Warby, I'm interested in that argument that Mr. Rogers, I thought, made effectively, that the sooner you start, the more you average out the ultimate cost that these things may have to have. Is that in the report somewhere, the averaging out, the goals? Have those goals been designed in a way that we're really thinking about the incremental cost and the impact that has? I'll let you, Mr. Darby, answer that too if you want.
I don't believe that we have that in the report, although if my colleagues can identify something that I've missed, I don't think it is there. Supporting that, we've done, as Ms. Clausen indicated, a fair amount of economic analysis, as have others like McKinsey, that suggest that the costs are manageable and less than the cost of inaction.
Yeah, I think Ms. Clausen used we talked some in the hearing already in your testimony about the 2020 figure. I guess I'll just go down the line, the same line that my friend Mr. Markey went down, and my question would be, are you confident that this doesn't have negative economic impact on your companies in terms of job loss or other cost in the first decade? And Mr. Mulva, I think you got to lead off last. That's really just a yes or no question. It's the first decade as opposed to between now and 2050.
Addressing climate change will increase our cost structure providing energy.
No, it will not, as a provider of the technology.
It will not have negative effects on my company, but if we aren't very careful to use the market mechanisms of cap and trade to limit the costs of what we do, it would have negative effects on our customers. That's why we think the cap and trade is so important.
Mr. Crane?
In the near term, if taken in its totality, it would not impact us in the near term. In the long term, it would hurt us if we don't adapt our technology, change the way we make electricity, which is part of the plan.
On balance, we believe the opportunities will outweigh the risks and costs.
In the first 10 years?
In the first 10 years.
Yes, sir. Mr. Imel?
Congressman, I would agree with my colleagues.
Mr. Rogers?
In the first 10 years, if the allocation method is done appropriate, it will minimize the cost impact, but there will be cost impact on our consumers. We're the third largest consumer of coal in the country, with 70% of our electricity coming from coal. And for the 25 states with more than 50% of their electricity from coal, it will also, if the allocation of allowance is not designed right, could result in significant increases in prices in each of those states.
And just very quickly, I'm over my time. Mr. Darby and
The answer is no.
Like Mr. Rogers, there will be cost increases that our customers will bear, but if it's done appropriately as we've laid out, we can minimize what those cost increases are.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Blunt. The chair would like to now recognize the Chairman Emeritus of the committee, Mr. Dingell, for his questions.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your courtesy. This question to Dow and DuPont, I believe Mr. Green and Mr. Sturber are present here. I have a great concern about designing the climate change program so as not to put our own American industry at a competitive disadvantage and driving jobs overseas. I'm particularly concerned about USCAP's views on one issue, and that is chemical companies such as Dow and DuPont, and that is about the possibility of massive fuel switching occurring from coal to natural gas. I have fears that this could create significant increases in the cost of natural gas, which is used both as a process and as a feedstock. Could Mr. Green or Mr. Sturber comment on that and tell me whether this issue was discussed at USCAP? Gentlemen, don't be shy. The clock is running.
They're not here. I mean, I'm happy.
Oh, they're
I'm
not
sorry,
here?
but they're not present, but maybe
Well,
I
could anyone then answer that?
Yeah, maybe I can reassure you that we spent a great deal of time with our concerns about trying to avoid the dash for gas, which would put DuPont and Dow at a disadvantage. And that is why we have the cost containment mechanisms that we've put in here, and that is why we think it is important when you consider allocation that you do so to companies that could be adversely affected.
Would anyone else like to make a comment?
I would add, Mr. Dingell, that the dash to gas is something that has been said is something that we're very, very focused on. And we must try to avoid near-term price spikes in cost of carbon. And that's why all of the mitigating mechanisms from allocations to the carbon board administering a reserve fund to the use of offsets are a critical component of this. Otherwise, we would run the risk of moving on to natural gas to the detriment not just of our chemical companies, but also of all consumers that use natural gas to heat their homes.
All right. Now, ladies and gentlemen, last year you will recall that Mr. Boucher and I released a discussion draft, which was our suggestions as to what the committee should consider as we proceed about this business. I'd like to have each of you give me some comments, or those of you who who would prefer to do so, to tell us about the blueprint released today and how it meshes with that draft or how it would work, because I believe that this is going to be a very important tool for this committee to use to begin to arrive at a consensus. Who would like to respond?
Thank you very much for the question. In our analysis, there are many elements of the discussion draft that you and Chairman Boucher prepared that is very consistent with what is in the blueprint. And I think we could answer specifically and do an analysis for you going forward. But a lot of the issues, the targets, the cost containment mechanisms, the various incentives to drive technology, I think are quite compatible, and both, I think, provide a blueprint for the committee to begin their deliberations this year on how to enact climate legislation quickly.
Would each of you who is disposed give us some comments on the question just asked? In other words, do this please for the record. And I ask, Mr. Chairman, that the record remain open so that we may have those responses included into the record on this matter.
Without objection, that will be the order.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dingell. Mr. Upton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think many of you know that our electricity demands are expected to, in this country are expected to grow by about 50% by the year 2030. Your plan, as you submitted this morning, will have a reduction in emissions by 40% by that same year and 80% by the year 2050. I wonder if any of you know when the last time our country, at what year did our country actually achieve the emissions that are mandated in this legislation or proposed by 2050? In other words, an 80% reduction. Any of you know, Mr. Krupp?
Well, I'd have to.
I'm told it was about 100 years ago that our emissions by 2050, in essence, would equal what was in the early 1900s.
Excellent question, Mr. Upton. The historical experience that we have in regulating emissions really most clearly is illustrated by the 1990 Clean Air Act, which called for a 50% reduction, not in 22 years as we're calling here, but a 50% reduction in only 10 years. That was achieved ahead of schedule for sulfur dioxide. And in fact, under the current administration, the Bush administration, the President has ordered an additional 70% cut in less than another decade. So combined, the two cuts in sulfur emissions that have been ordered are greater than 80% in a much shorter time frame and have been achieved at a fraction of the cost that was predicted by the opponents.
Well, this, of course, would be carbon emission reductions.
That's absolutely true. I think that the sulfur is very instructive experience. With carbon, the opportunities for reducing, especially when you consider offsets, are much broader than with sulfur. With sulfur, you really needed end-of-the-pipe technology. With carbon energy efficiency, reducing the input from by using offsets from farmers who can contribute to reductions opens up a wider array of possibilities. So I think there's reason to be more optimistic here.
Okay. Mr. Rogers, you indicated that unless we perfected the CCS process certainly by the year 2015, that it would be very difficult to achieve the proposed reductions by 2020 as well as 2030 and 2050. You know that Mr. Boucher and I introduced legislation in the last Congress that proposed a path to get that. We appreciated the industry's support for sure, but that legislation languished. It did not move out of this committee. The chairman has indicated that he'd like to pass the overall legislation in the next 4 months. You indicated that it'd be at least 5 years before we'd see whether this is perfected or not. Can you achieve these reductions without CCS?
It would be my judgment that One, I was very supportive of that legislation. I think it is critical. And it would be my judgment that without that legislation or a comparable effort, that we would be in a place where we can't achieve the targets. But I would say one other thing that I think is very important for this committee to appreciate. These targets can be met only if we have aggressive energy efficiency. These targets can only be met if we have renewables, and renewables that we can actually get to market, which means eminent domain, because renewables without eminent domain will not get to market, given the ability to build and to build transmission. Thirdly, in every study, and I would refer you to the EPRI study, a key component of being able to achieve these levels and to supply electricity to our economy is require a significant build out of nuclear units going forward. And if you take any of these off the table, take coal off the table, or if you take nuclear off the table, our ability to hit these targets just not a mission that can be achieved.
Mr. Darby, would you agree with that?
I agree that we need all of the different technologies that have been identified. The one thing I would say is that with a cost put on carbon, there are all sorts of new technologies that we haven't identified yet that may be available in 2020, and that they may substitute to the extent that we have.
I want to get my last question, and I appreciate it. Mr. Krupp, Ms. Beinecke, did you all take a stand on the CCS legislation in the last Congress?
We did not.
Go ahead, Fred.
On the House Upton
yes,
bill?
we did, and we supported that legislation.
You did support
and the CCS provisions, because we think getting CCS going rapidly is absolutely critical to solving the problem.
Thank you. Time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Upton. Now recognizing members on the rules under, in the order in which they appeared at the committee today, Ms. Capps, you would be next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Part of the reason we're here today is that year after year, our understanding of climate change science has grown. Computer models that predicted increasing temperature, changes in ocean heat content, and decreases in Arctic sea ice been strongly supported by subsequent observation. As this committee takes up legislation to address climate change, we will need to stay apprised of the latest climate science. We'll also need to think through the economic effects of our actions. If history is a guide, there will be some who will argue that it's simply too expensive to take action. Each time Congress has considered adopting environmental protections in the past, we've heard the same story. Now, Mr. Krupp, I'd like to build on the interaction that you just had with my colleague, Mr. Upton, and you and I have had a working relationship in my congressional district on the Central Coast in a little fishing village called Morro Bay. You helped us demonstrate that we could save that village by protecting the environment could actually ensure business growth for those fishermen. I know that the Environmental Defense Fund employs PhD economists, and I'd like to ask you about the predictive powers of this discipline. Could you talk about the history of cost predictions for previous environmental legislation? Particularly, I'd like to hear some background on the accuracy of predictions about the 1990 acid rain program, part of the Clean Air Act's cap and trade system.
Thank you. It's an excellent question, and it turns out that it's very hard for the economic models to predict the impact of a dynamic incentive to come up with new technologies. And these economic models historically have always underestimated the innovation factor. Specifically, you ask about the Clean Air Act of 1990. Costs for removing a ton of sulfur dioxide were estimated anywhere between $800 a ton and over $2,000 a ton. In the first phase of the program, costs turned out to be, which is what the estimates were for, less than $100 a ton. So the estimates were wrong by up to a factor of 10-fold. And the reason is that the cap and trade creates buyers for the lowest cost technology. It creates a hunt. It creates incentives to innovate, and that basically grinds down the cost And that would be my comment. Historically, economists have always overestimated the costs, without exception.
Well, given our apparent difficulties in predicting how the economy would change, it's still a very vitally important topic. Do you have any advice on how policymakers could best make use of economic predictions about climate and energy policy?
Well, I think the models still are useful because they do tell us that the design of the program by your committee will be extremely important in terms of cost. They tell us that I don't think they can give us a number of what the costs will be, but they say there are some things that you can do that will make a big difference, and they show us relatively they will be more or less expensive. For example, allowing the use of offsets will drive the cost down substantially, and all the models from MIT, Harvard, do show that, and I do think those qualitative conclusions are correct. They show that the more trading you allow, the more flexibility between gases and between sectors that you allow, the more you will drive the costs down of the program.
Let me just ask, this I believe is an important topic, if any of the rest of you, particularly those of you who represent an industry, would have some advice along this line, or examples.
Congresswoman Capps, I basically agree with what Mr. Krupp said. I think we should extrapolate from sulfur, which is something you didn't want to burn in the first place, to carbon, which is something you're burning by intent rather carefully. So I don't think we can be confident of that level of difference between our hopes and our fears. But I strongly agree with Mr. Krupp on the importance of the trading system. This is why other measures are not adequate. We know the new president will propose a stimulus package. We're all looking forward to it in hopes. We know this Congress will consider renewable portfolio standards anew. But, you know, my company has tried very hard to analyze the different costs of low-carbon energy and put it in a common frame of dollars per ton of CO2. And we know that some energy efficiency is as good as free. We just don't know how much because nobody can do a good curve. Reducing carbon through natural gas consumption is somewhere on the orders of $10 a ton per CO2. We think nuclear is something like 40, and today's wind something like 80, whereas solar is still above 100, probably around 3. But solar is evolving technologically. If you do this all with a relatively crude tool like RPS, you will tend to get the more expensive solutions, whereas if you have the cap and trade system, as Mr. Krupp has said, in the long run, you'll get the lower cost solutions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Capps. Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also would like to thank all of you for taking time for your busy schedules to be with us today as we explore options and issues relating to this serious subject matter. I noticed that Mr. Markey in his questions to you, Mr. Chiaro, announced that you operate the second largest coal producer in the U.S., but it was my understanding that you all recently announced your plans to divest that coal operation in the U.S. Now, that would lead me to believe that since you are part of an organization that wants to put a cap on carbon, and you've made a decision to sell the coal-producing part of your company, that you're not optimistic about the profitability of operating a coal company in the U.S. Is that true or not?
Thank you for the question. The impetus behind putting a number of our assets around the world for sale was really the acquisition of a company called Alcan, a major aluminum producer. And the principal reason that we bought Alcan is because they have a large proportion of the power that's required to produce aluminum is produced by hydro, a low-carbon emitting form of energy. So only in that sense was the decision to sell a range of assets, including our some of our coal assets here in the U.S. related to climate change. When we looked at the assets that we would sell and the criteria that we used to distinguish those that we would put up for sale versus those that we would keep, climate change was indeed on the list, but it was very far down the list. It wasn't even in the top 5 criteria. The principal reasons for deciding to sell some of our coal assets in the U.S., by the way, not all of them, really was related to profitability. And I must say the Bureau of Land Management does a good job of extracting value for the taxpayers out of the coal deposits in the Powder River Basin, so I congratulate them.
And do you all operate any coal facilities outside the U.S.?
Indeed we do. We are the largest coal producer in Australia, and we have very active exploration programs underway to find more coal around the rest of the world.
Well, what about China?
We do not have any activities underway in China right now. We don't mine coal in China. In fact, we sell very little coal of our coal into China. China, as you're aware, is the largest producer of coal in the world right now.
You know, Mr. Amelt, when I go to the Rotary Club down in my district, people oftentimes complain that on environmental issues that the U.S., they're advocates that we should lead the way, and your organization is saying that we should lead the way on cap and trade, for example. And yet in China, they're bringing on one new coal-powered plant every 2 weeks. In fact, I read that last year, just electricity produced by coal in China exceeded all electricity produced by every measure in Great Britain last year, just the new. And I know that your company is certainly selling a lot of equipment to build some of those new coal-powered plants in China. What about this criticism that if we take a lead on this, China is not following us at all, and the detrimental impact it'll have on our economy, the detrimental impact it'll have on, because our electricity costs are going to be higher? What about that argument?
Congressman, we spent quite a bit of time just trying to frame the globalization debate. You'll see an entire section as part of the blueprint where we talk about the ability to drive competitiveness so that our industries aren't disadvantaged versus China and India. And clearly, if you think about Dow, DuPont, GE, Alcoa, the people that are up here, we need to run, kind of globally competitive footprint. And so we think about that. The other counter I would make, sir, is that, we are a net exporter of clean products. And so I really believe that there is an export opportunity here if we lead and innovate in the area of high-efficiency engines, in the area of super light materials, and some of the entrepreneurial structure that exists.
Did you all actually sell $600 billion worth of wind power equipment last year?
Not $600 billion. No, I wish, but that's
well, Mr. Markey said they went
billion.
from $300 million to
about $6 billion last year.
How much?
About $6 billion last year.
$6 billion. Oh, okay.
Yes, sir.
One final comment I would just make. I was reading this article in the New York Times, basically a few months ago. It said that in Europe, which created the world's largest greenhouse gas market, 3.5 years ago, early evidence suggests the whole approach could fail because emissions are going up. The GAO came out in December 2008 on a study of the European Union's emission trading system, and they basically said that available information could not substantiate emissions and reductions, could not substantiate any development of new technology, growth in the economy, or any of the things that you all are saying can flow from a cap-and-trade system. I say that simply as we move forward. Obviously, we're going to get into this. All of us, I think, have the right goals in mind. We want to be fair-minded. We don't want to put the U.S. at a disadvantage economically. So I look forward to working with all of you and the other committee members as we move forward.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I suggest we look at this panel for just a moment. Not only is it huge, but it reflects the gamut of interests in this issue, from fossil fuel producers to environmental advocates. And I suggest, as I did in opening remarks about an hour ago before the panel was physically in front of us, that this is the model to solve these problems. My guess is that some of you voted for the incoming administration, some of you didn't. But that doesn't matter. What all of you are doing is trying to help both, I think, the administration and this diverse committee solve a tough problem. And I don't think it should matter on this committee whether we supported the next administration or we didn't. I personally did. But I also think that having all of you buy into a solution is the way that solution will work. And I'm looking at nodding heads, so I'm very happy to see that. I talked earlier about what I call the public-private model and how we use it to solve one little tiny energy efficiency issue, and that is light bulbs. Mr. Immelt, you were part of our conspiracy, and so was the NRDC, and it was hard to figure out a program that would really get us to much more efficient light bulbs by 2020. But guess what we did, and we got almost unanimous support in this committee and in the Congress for what we came up with. So I just put it out there that what I call the public-private model is the best model to solve these problems. Now, all of the solutions will depend on something we really haven't talked about this morning, and that's what I want to ask a question about and invite any of you to comment on, and that is a smart grid. If we don't have a smart grid, certainly the efficiency pieces of this solution won't work. I just learned that in our new stimulus package, there will be about $10 billion for investments in smart grid development. But I would like to invite you to talk about, any of you, maybe Mr. Immelt, we should start with you, the smart grid and why it is a critical piece of the solution.
Congresswoman, I believe that I would talk about both a grid that is smarter and bigger. Maybe start with bigger first. It was mentioned earlier that if we're going to increase the penetration of renewables in the country, we're going to need a bigger pipe to push the renewables through from a storage and efficiency standpoint. So there needs to be some accommodation there. And as far as a smart grid, and my colleagues that run utilities here are probably even more expert than we are, there's such a huge advantage in efficiency, in empowerment to consumers, and we view this as both a conservation advantage and also a tremendous advantage to reduce global warming. So I think the technology actually exists today. It's just how it gets deployed through the utility structure, what consumer incentives, but the technology exists to really empower consumers to make substantial, and industrial customers to make substantial decreases in their use of energy.
Thank you. Before recognizing anyone else, let me just ask if anyone disagrees that the smart grid is a critical part of the solution. Okay. Who else would like to comment?
If I could comment, and my colleague to my right from Duke Energy was struggling to get the microphone, but in answer to your question,
I'm sure we can accommodate him too.
We're in the midst at PG&E of deploying 10 million smart meters, and this is the enabling strategy for tremendous energy efficiency, demand management, and frankly, one of the things that will solve this country's energy security issues the best. It enables the electric car that is coming down the road, and we will see between 2010 and 2020. So it is critically important. We're moving on it. It also provides the opportunity for smart appliances within the home. What we envision is people pulling up their computer on their home page, understanding how much power they're currently using, and noting if there are any deviations, if power is being used at an unusually high level in the cellar, in the bedrooms, in the attic, wherever, and so they can call home and say, something's wrong here and we got a problem, we ought to turn off the power.
We only have time for one more comment, but I would invite, Mr. Chairman, may I request that others can submit their answers for the record? And
objection, they'll be welcome.
Before we call on our friend from Duke Energy, I would just observe, too, that a smart grid needs to be resilient to withstand a cyber attack or other hacking. Let's just hear one more comment now.
We support smart grid. In fact, in our 5-year capital plan, we're going to spend $1.5 billion making our grid smart. But smart grid means different things to different people. What it means to us is it means taking our analog grid and making it digital. At the end of the day, that will reduce line losses and will save energy. The second thing it means to us, it means putting smart meters in. And smart meters will really allow us, and we're deploying them today, will allow us to have a more sophisticated energy efficiency approach, as Peter Darby was talking about. Many people think of the smart grid as simply transmission lines, but the reality of that is really not technically the smart grid. It's more in the distribution part of the system.
Great. Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to touch on a couple of points. I represent a very rural district. We have 10 or 11 national forests within that district, and I've been real active on forest management policy. Catastrophic wildfires account for vast amounts of greenhouse gas emissions every year. With a hotter and drier climate projected for the West and for the northern end of our country, this situation will only be exacerbated. Depending on the fire severity and forest type, up to 100 tons of carbon per acre can be released, and in 2007 alone, 10 million acres of forest burned. Now, by conservative estimates, that means that 60 million tons of carbon dioxide was spewed into the atmosphere, not to mention all the other greenhouse gases and pollutants. That's roughly the equivalent of 12 million vehicle emissions for 1 year. According to the EPA, 562.3 million metric tons of carbon were unleashed upon the atmosphere by forest fires between 2000 and 2005. Now, there's a study out on national forests in eastern Washington that showed that those forests left alone will become net emitters of carbon rather than carbon sinks by the late century due to emissions from catastrophic fire. The forest would likely burn at a rate of 1.7% per year, meaning the entire forest would burn in less than 100 years. Actively managed forests can lead to at least a 50 to 60% reduction in the current level of acreage burned due to wildfire. So my question to you is, and we have an obligation as stewards of these great federal forests to better manage them. And I'd like to know if anybody objects to changing federal law to be able to more actively manage these forests along the lines of what this Congress passed several years ago with the Healthy Forest Initiative, Healthy Forest Restoration Act. Does anybody object to moving forward over the condition class 2 and 3 lands and give the Forest Service the authority to do what they do around our communities?
I'll address that. Mark Tursick from the Nature Conservancy.
Yes, sir.
Fire protection is not part of the scope of our blueprint. But the Nature Conservancy, certainly as a conservation organization, strongly supports those type of initiatives.
I appreciate that.
On the broad topic of forests, we would like to note that we do call for forest offsets in this document, both domestically and internationally, not only as an important source of cost containment, but as an important opportunity to protect our forests for a whole range of benefits.
Okay.
And we also note that the U.S. has an opportunity to be a real leader here.
I'm going to have to cut you off because I've only got a couple of minutes. I'm sorry, but I appreciate that, and I appreciate the work, and I've toured some of your sites out in my district where you've done a terrific job doing the thing that needs to be done. Mr. Rowe?
Congressman, I would point out not only do we not object, but the offset provisions in the USCAP recommendations would create an incentive for folks like us to invest in better forest management.
On federal lands?
Either way. That's the way the offset provisions would work.
All right. Then I want to move on to wind, because my district probably has as much wind as many others, not many others in the country. And in fact, the Bonneville grid will have up to 30% of its power from wind energy within the next 2 years, which I think is the highest percentage of any grid in the country. The point I raise is that in order to smooth that load, they are now being faced with having to put gas peaking plants in place. So you all recognize the fact that there are limitations to some of these alternatives, correct? Does anybody want to comment on that? Mr. Nolan?
I mean, certainly there's a couple issues with wind. First of all, you've got to move the wind to where the people are. You mentioned your district did not have the numbers of people, so the grid comes into a very important point with the grid. We need to do more in storage technologies of how do you store, but the facts are, at the present time, wind is not a peak load source, and so you need some sources behind it to ensure.
To firm it up.
To firm it up.
Absolutely. And in the Northwest, of course, we use hydro. And one of the issues we have in the Northwest is what sort of credit allocation would there be in a cap-and-trade system for a system that has traditionally relied on hydro? And who picks the date that decides the water flowing through a dam is renewable and producing energy is renewable, and the water flowing through a more modern dam isn't renewable, or vice versa? How do you account for hydropower as a renewable energy source if it's been in place since Franklin Roosevelt was president? Do you include that as a renewable or not, and if not, why?
Well, the beauty of a cap-and-trade system, Congressman, is that hydropower would not require any permits, so there would be no costs imposed on it. So although we're not proposing an RPS, so that definition, is not directly relevant here,
but it would be under an RPS.
It would be, but that's not what we are here to propose.
But it all melds together.
Under a cap-and-trade system, all hydro is advantaged.
So it's credited?
It doesn't need a...
Or only new hydro's credited?
Old and new hydro, all generating electricity has no carbon output. Yep.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of the panelists for being here and for the blueprint. I said in my opening statement that given the diversity of the group, we really appreciate the fact that you're able to come up with a consensus document. I have a couple of, I think, brief questions. But one of the 6 key principles in the call for action is be fair to all economic sectors, geographic regions, and economic groups that may be disproportionately impacted. And some of the more disproportionately impacted communities in our country would be poor and minority, and sometimes they're the same. So were there any special considerations in the, I haven't had a chance to go through the entire report for low-income, minority, disadvantaged populations?
If I might address that, what is provided for is that in the case of local distribution companies, that the benefits of allocations be passed through to customers, and what we're proposing is that they be passed to the local distribution companies, and those companies are required to pass those on to the consumers. And in the case of regulated electric utilities, what we're proposing is the local utility commissions would undertake that program. Specific to your question, in California, the approach that we've taken is we have a REACH program, and so those people who don't have the economic resources to pay for their bills in full, we provide economic support for them. We also have a program on energy efficiency where for low-income individuals, they can contact our company. We will send people out to an energy audit, and then the utility will pay for the improvements to their home to make it more energy efficient. So that was the way that we were thinking about addressing the particular question you raised.
Okay, I'll take one more answer then
If I might,
to my next question.
We also have provisions for funding for what we call adaptation to climate change, inevitable climate change, including overseas, including island countries that we can anticipate
because that was my
vulnerable.
that was my next question, because I obviously live in the Caribbean and we're small economies, fragile economies, and I was wondering, so if you would just expand on maybe what you were going to say about the Caribbean.
Yeah, the Conservancy, our scientists advise us that there's great opportunity to invest in natural ecosystems that provide very important adaptation benefits to vulnerable people. And in our blueprint, we recommend that funding be made available from the sale of allowances to pay for these programs, both overseas and in the U.S.
Thanks. At a retreat I attended last week, I came across a new concept that I also mentioned in my opening statement, which is cap and dividends as an alternative to cap and trade. And I wonder if anyone would like to comment on the differences or the advantages of one over the other, cap and dividends.
Well, that's a topic that's gotten increased interest over the last year, and one of the things that we envision is first allocations and then move it into an auction system, and that the proceeds of the auction, some would go towards technology development, but the bulk of the resources over time would go back to the consumer, and that is the dividend concept. So I think that the question for the committee to consider in drafting legislation is sort of what the time frame is for returning that, that very significant resource to the consumer.
So it doesn't have to be an either or. It can be
we envision a system that actually moves from one to the other over time. I think that those proposing the cap and dividend system do envision going totally in one direction, but USCAP blueprint actually envisions first an allocation, then moving to auction over time.
Thank you.
But let me say, a cap and dividend has the potential of creating huge subsidies where most of the money would come from states that are heavily dependent on coal, like Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and that, for instance, you would take $100 out of a state like Ohio and only send $40 back, and the money would go someplace else. So there is some equity issues associated with the proposed cap and dividend approach.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the panel being here. I wish you would have been here for a lot of the opening statements. I did find the benefit of the opening statement, though, Mr. Chairman, as I had to go do other business, had steering committee meetings, and since many of these members are leaving at 12:30, it was my luck that I got back in time to get around to questions. If we don't have opening statements and we don't have a chance to talk to you, one of the arguments I made yesterday is one of the importance for you all. You're doing what you think is important for your association or your shareholders. You know, we have the burden of doing what's critically important to our constituents, and they're not minor. Each of us represent 660,000 voters. I was interested, one of the things I said in my opening statement was the interest in your first release, which had the trading floor as part of the debate on how a cap and trade through the trading floor could be helpful. It was very curious that in this new one, no trading floor, no picture. And I would argue that's for a reason. I would argue because in this cap and trade debate, which we like to liken to the Clean Air Act and the NOx and the SOx, there are distinct differences. One is technology was available then, is still not available now. What is being proposed in a cap and trade under this venue is bringing in the huge money managers, the Goldman Sachs in the world, into this debate to incentivize. The other thing about the cap and trade that we need to continue to talk about is the loss of value that has happened in the stock exchange in the past couple months. I want to be clear. You all know, we've met, had dinner, a lot of friends. I am opposed. But if we want to be clear to my voters, we enact a carbon tax. They know exactly what the cost is going to be to them, the consumers that are going to have to pay for this move. Any other process, I will argue, unless you can convince me, is a shell game meant to hide the costs from the consumer. And I will, and we'll have a chance at it. It's interesting on the association too. And I know Rio Tinto has some mining operations, but no one else. Where's the coal mine operators? And the other thing about the association is, where's the members of organized labor? Where's the United Mine Workers? I'm a Republican. They a lot of times don't like me just by definition. But I have a great relationship with the operating engineers. I have a great relationship with the Boilermakers. I have a great relationship, again, with the operating engineers. I have an interesting relationship with the United Mine Workers. I have a good relationship with those who build the next generation of power plants today and tomorrow. Where are they to weigh in on what this is going to affect to the membership? Because I could tell you, as I did in my opening statement, I'm going to go to them. And I'm going to want them to be on board. So when there is job loss, which I predict will happen, we can talk about green jobs, but the proportional ratio of building a coal power plant and putting up windmills, which are being built in my district too, there's no comparable ratio about the jobs and operating a major nuclear power plant or a coal-fired plant as a windmill. We can talk green jobs all we want, real jobs or in real manufacturing. And I'm going to hold, as I'm going to talk to my friends on the other side, I'm going to hold that issue. Mr. Rowe is a good friend. Illinois is a big power state, coal, marginal oil, now wind, nuclear power. Nuclear power has to be part of this debate. How can we move to nuclear power expansion, Mr. Rowe, if we do not move aggressively on the high-level nuclear waste in Yucca Mountain?
Congressman Shimkus, you are indeed a good friend, and as you know, I respect you immensely, both when we agree and on those rare occasions when we disagree. One of the things we share is a commitment to the importance of transparency so the public knows what it's getting. I have, as several of the members of this panel have, in the past supported a carbon tax to deal with this problem for the transparency reason, but it never seems to catch on. Resources for the Future did a study and found most Americans want to deal with the carbon issue. Most Americans don't like a carbon tax because they know it costs them money. They're pretty suspicious of a cap-and-trade system because they rightly think it will cost them money, but they think renewable portfolio standards will be free. As I indicated while you were called away to something else, we have at Exelon tried to study the cost of all sorts of low-carbon solutions. Energy efficiency, which is free for a while, but not forever. Gas, which is low cost, but an awful lot to bet on one thing. Nuclear, that we think costs around $40 a ton. And various forms of renewables, which tend to be much higher. I believe we need nuclear in this puzzle. You
Mr.
know
Rowe,
I
if you
believe
can
it.
finish up, please. The gentleman's time's expired.
Sorry, I took too much of your time.
Yucca Mountain?
I'm sorry,
Can
the
he
gentleman's time's expired. Gentlemen.
So he can't answer the question on Yucca Mountain? Just yes or no? It needs to be.
The gentleman would certainly.
That was the question.
Gentleman would certainly be happy,
Would Mr. Rowe, if I provide, can I provide for a response, a question in writing?
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Smith.
I come from one of those so-called coal districts that Mr. Shimkus identified earlier in his opening. And apart from that, it's a district that has been suffering from higher than average unemployment rates in a state that suffers higher than average nationwide. Our poverty rates exceed 20 and sometimes 30% in some of my counties. The jobs that we do have aren't paying enough to get many people out of poverty. Tens of thousands of people are working in poverty. And Mr. Shimkus has posed a rhetorical question about labor. Where is labor? What about organized labor? And I think that raises a larger question that I'd be curious, Mr. Rogers, if you could respond. What effect would this rather sweeping measure have on the creation of jobs?
First, I appreciate, because as you know, we serve Ohio also, and we have over 11 million people that we serve, including many in Ohio. When I look at this legislation, this blueprint, several places where I see jobs that work in your part of the world. One is if we can successfully achieve carbon capture and sequestration, we can deploy it. That keeps coal in the mix in a low-carbon world, and that means jobs. It also means jobs in terms of actually the building of coal gasification facilities in lieu of traditional coal plants. It means building jobs with respect to building the carbon capture and sequestration going forward. I think it's going to mean new nuclear plants, and there are going to be significant jobs that come from that. I believe in terms of energy efficiency, there will be jobs. So as I look at this, I believe not just in the short term, but in the longer term, jobs will be created as we fundamentally transform our energy infrastructure.
And has thought been given, and I apologize for not having been able to read the entire report as of yet, but has thought been given to the educational and training process and national policies that could be implemented that would help develop a workforce in a comprehensive and practical fashion to fill these potential jobs of the future?
We have not addressed that specific aspect of it, but I do believe as we look at new technologies, whether they're clean tech, renewables, advanced technologies in nuclear, advanced coal technologies, advanced gas, I think in all these areas it's going to take a significant number of new engineers and technicians in order for this to happen. So I fundamentally believe this is going to happen. I personally believe it's going to happen anyway, because I look at our fleet, and by 2050, every power plant we have today will be retired. So if I know what the rules are with respect to carbon, it allows us to make investments consistent with achieving a low carbon footprint, but at the same time of retiring and replacing, and that process alone will create significant jobs over the future period.
Could I just, Jim, briefly correct you? Actually, the blueprint specifically addresses, Congressman, the issue you raised and the need for training. It is one of the goals we set out for the allocation system to provide for the training of the workforce needed to facilitate these wide-scale transitions.
And are specific national policies suggested on how best to implement those goals?
In detail, sir.
Thank you.
Space, yes. If two of you have asked the question regarding labor unions, and I'd just like to mention that, and it was not on the House side, but a year and a half ago, I stood with Senator Bingaman, Chairman Bingaman, with the IBEW and I believe the AFL-CIO. I need to verify that that was the second union that endorsed a bill that was put forward on the Senate side, which was a cap-and-trade bill by Senator Bingaman, Senator Murkowski, and a number of others.
Has organized labor been involved in any respect with regards to this USCAP finding? All right, thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrey.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And thank all of you for being here and bringing us the blueprint. I want to read from the summary overview in your final your commitment, the last paragraph. We, the members of the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, pledge to work with the President, the Congress, and all other stakeholders to enact an environmentally effective, economically sustainable, and fair climate change program consistent with our principles at the earliest practicable date. And I heard either one of the witnesses or maybe a member of the committee say earlier that the goal was to have legislation to the President before the Memorial Day break. So that's coming up pretty darn soon. You know, we are obviously in a pretty tough economic environment. In this last year, what 2.5 million jobs lost. Right now, we're on the floor about to vote on a bill, the second tranche, the $350 billion of the rescue package, to try to do something about this economy, to get it back on track. And yet, what I'm hearing from you, from USCAP, is you're recommending something whose cornerstone is cap and trade, a mandatory cap and trade regime, and that it needs to be done with all due haste. My question to you, and any of you can respond, is this. are you willing to sacrifice more American jobs to achieve the goals of your report? Are you, at this crucial time in our nation's history, willing to push forward with all due haste, maybe by Memorial Day weekend, with legislation calling for mandatory cap and trade as its cornerstone, and at the risk of losing additional jobs? Anyone?
Congressman, it's a great question, and I think it speaks to an important point, which is the timing question. If climate change legislation is passed, that's got to be implemented with the cap and trade in several years' time. I believe, and certainly speaking on behalf of my company, the first thing I'll do is I'll unleash additional investment by us in various technologies designed to prepare for the cap and trade system that's coming. So, you know, this may be counterintuitive, but I think quite the contrary. In the near term, it will actually unleash investment and create jobs. And we, and many of the companies that sit here, we have very substantial capital. I think my company and Jeff's are the two smallest at this panel. We sit with $1.5 billion in investment capital ready to invest, but we need to know in what direction.
Make one comment to say we've talked a lot this morning about cost. I think as a group, and that I know for myself, that we are much better at driving costs down than we are with uncertainty. And this is what we have tried to do, is bring some certainty to our program so that we then can plan. My personal belief is that the uncertainty has caused a lot more of our stock prices and employment loss than the cost.
Well, I want to make sure you understand my question before we get another response. It's really a value question, a value judgment. Even if you would respond and say, well, no, you believe we won't lose more jobs, we'll create jobs. But I want you to respond to me in regard to that value judgment if, in fact, jobs will be lost. It's a question, I guess, of collateral damage. We ask those questions all the time of our military. Is it worth the sacrifice wherever we're engaged? And so that's my question now. And it's all about the timing and how important is it. Is this something that in 2007, January, was clearly appropriate to say with all due haste when everything looked kind of rosy out there? But right now when things look pretty grim, is with all due haste really appropriate in regard to mandatory cap and trade, or is it something that may not be put too much on the back burner but could wait a couple of years?
Congressman, in your job there are no risk votes. In my job there are no risk energy supply options. We both labor as best we can to make decisions or recommendations that try to minimize risk. In my judgment, the economic efficiency of a cap and trade system radically reduces the risk of dealing with climate change, which we must do. In my judgment, starting soon with appropriate cost constraints protects the economy better than putting off a solution and then perhaps doing something more drastic or more disingenuous. It's all a matter of trying in our frail way to handle risk as best we can.
Thank you, Mr. Gingrey. Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sitting here with this panel in front of me is like a child in a candy store. So unfortunately, I only have 5 minutes. I'd like to start with Mr. Darby. I have a long relationship with PG&E as a customer and as a business partner, and I've always found PG&E to be a good business partner to deal with. Now, my question for you is, you're embarking on a very aggressive program for efficiency and bringing in other technology to generate new power. Could you explain briefly how that benefits your bottom line?
Well, with energy efficiency, we've collaborated with the state of California, and what occurs there is that the cost of new energy efficiency to our customers is about 3 cents. what we've entered into is a framework in California of where if demand for energy goes up, our revenues go down. It's called decoupling. So we are indifferent to the amount of power we sell. And if we create savings for our customers, what happens is that we share some of the savings, a small fraction of the savings. So on energy efficiency, which is one way that we meet increased power needs, we make money that way. If we build new power plants, and most of the power plants are built by others, if others build new power plants and we procure that power, we make zero money. It costs X, we pay X for it, we make no money. If about a third of the new power plants that we build, if we build them, we earn a return on the investment, the equity investment that we have in it. Is that responsive to your question?
It is, thank you. My next question will be for Mr. Imelt. GE is a leader in producing new energy technology, renewable energy technology, and I have to say some of the work I did in the earlier life benefited the technology that you're using. Do you see this as a growing part of your bottom line, and will cap-and-trade legislation help that bottom line grow as a part of your business model?
I think, Congressman, we're already maybe a $40 or $45 billion company just in energy, and we invest heavily in R&D as part of that. And so we have products that do coal, gas, wind, solar, nuclear. We're really almost agnostic as to technology. We do it on a global basis, and so even without a cap-and-trade program, we would have a prosperous energy business because we're really technically agnostic. What I would say is, as a businessman and as an American businessman, is that the energy sector has been chronically underinvested for a generation in terms of new innovation and technology. If you just look at a pie chart of where the aggregate R&D dollars have gone in this country since World War II, it is hard to find energy on that segment. I like solving problems with technology. That's what GE does as a company. So anything that makes technology come to the fore is going to be good for GE over time. And what I believe is that a price for carbon will allow many of these technologies that have been around for a generation. Coal gasification has been around for a generation. Nuclear has been around for a generation. Elements of the smart grid have been around for a generation. We just haven't commercialized them and taken them down the cost curve to make them as competitive as they can be. So I view this at its, we all come to this with a different perspective. I view it as at its core is a price for carbon is going to bring energy technology into the 21st century and give the United States a chance to lead.
Thank you. Many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have decried the failure of the European cap-and-trade system. Now, when I hear Mr. Krupp and Ms. Clausen talk about offsets, I get nervous because I'm thinking about grandfathering, which in my opinion is largely responsible for whatever problems the European cap-and-trade system has had. So would you be clear about whether you're including grandfathering on offsets, Mr. Krupp?
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge the concerns of the members of the minority about the European ETS system. It got off to a rough start. Since then, they have corrected many of the early problems. The principal problem in Europe is that they didn't have good inventory numbers for the baseline, which in this country, thanks to legislation passed out of this committee in 1990 and part of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, we have long had excellent baseline information about the emissions of CO2 from power plants. I don't think we'll repeat that mistake. In Europe, one of the mistakes, I believe, is that they have not allowed agricultural offsets in the system, and we do recommend that EPA start a process that could lead to verified, scientifically valid offsets from the agricultural sector to be part of the system.
Thank you, Mr. McNerney. Ms. Sutton?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate that you're coming together to try and create a solution. In fact, Mr. Emil, I noted in your testimony you said on the final page near the end, our commitment as a group now is to work with Congress, both houses, both parties, the new administration, and other stakeholders to enact this year, if possible, climate legislation consistent with the principles underlying the call for action and the blueprint, namely, that legislation must be fair, environmentally protective, and economically sustainable for our country. And I would just add a couple of words as a representative from Ohio, that after the word country, we say including Ohio, okay? So from now on, when you guys are looking at that statement, I want in the back of your minds to be including Ohio. And I'm sure that that is what's intended. As a new member to the committee, I do have a question. We've heard some discussion about who's at the table and who's not at the table. Could somebody just briefly explain to me how you all came to be and whether or not there is a place at the table for organized labor, or are they welcome at the table? Could you just, someone answer that for me?
Well, I would say that we've been doing this for maybe 2.5 or 3 years, and the idea was to try to get a representative sample, of different industry sectors and NGOs to come together. In that sense, probably most of us have reviewed a lot of the elements of this with our own unions and our own teams inside the company. There was never a desire to exclude anyone from the table. But I can tell you, with 31 people, it's been hard enough to get to this point from a standpoint of how far we've gotten. And we look forward to further dialogue under your leadership to make sure that everybody's represented. But there was always a sense that the more people we could have in, the better.
I appreciate that, and also as a member of Congress, the ability to work in a large group.
Me too.
Yeah. So a couple of you, manufacturing obviously is important to me, and in the considerations of manufacturing as we foster this solution that I believe can be attained. Several of you, Mr. Imel and Mr. Nolan in particular, have talked about the timing of what we're doing, or I think, Mr. Nolan, you more specifically, and the need to pass this climate legislation quickly for several reasons. One, you said to send the right signal, to get the investment going. Do you also have concern about the delay resulting in what would be even steeper requirements to be achieved more quickly in the future? And tell me how that would impact your organizations.
I think Jeff put it correctly first, is that just like his company, our company is in all of these spaces. We also have limited capital as to where we need to go and to make those investments. In order for me to meet Mr. Rogers' time frame to do more with sequestration and other things, we need to put more capital into that, and we need to have more certainty on the return on our investment in those areas. We have choices as to where we put it. Do we put more in gas? Do we put more in wind? Do we put more in these areas? And these are all decisions that we must make. And that's why we need to speed it up in order to make the end of the line really happen. Because it starts really with Jeff and ourselves and other large companies who put the capital in to build the innovation to these products.
Certainty in the investment world is critical to success. And what we lack today is certainty in terms of what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. I would argue that today we have almost the worst of all worlds. We have 17 states that are developing their own programs. We have RPS in some areas, not in others. The fact is that the last 40-plus coal plants haven't been permitted. So we have an energy policy, it's just that nobody knows what it is. And it shows up in terms of those consequences. So, look, I say this with great respect to my colleagues. I didn't come to this as an environmentalist. I come to it as an industrialist. I'm a capitalist, pure, plain and simple. And I just think the system we have today is untenable over the long term, insofar as, the science is so compelling on global warming. Something's going to happen. The more certainty you can give us, the better we can respond and be efficient on behalf of our shareholders.
Mr. Rogers, did you have a comment?
I see this from the perspective of 700,000 customers just in Ohio, and the families and businesses behind them. And I'm making decisions today about what to build and to get prepared. And the sooner we get started, I think the better off we'll be, because Ohio is very dependent on coal. And if we can smooth out, and that's what was appealing about the compromise that was reached here, there was a recognition that we had to buffer during the transition period on the consumers of Ohio and all the consumers. So in a sense, as a CEO of a regulated utility, I'm here really standing in the shoes of my consumers, saying, let's do this in a way that minimizes cost increases and cost impacts, because there will be increased costs, and let's smooth it out. If we delay this 3 years or 5 years, it's only going to translate, I believe, in a steeper cost curve and a more draconian outcome for consumers.
Thank you, Ms. Sutton. Ms. DeGette?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Several of the witnesses today have mentioned the renewable portfolio standard, and I think it was Mr. Rowe who said that as a tool for change, it's sort of a blunt instrument, and that he would prefer to see a cap and trade system that might be more flexible. And I was kind of struck, too, by what Mr. Immelt just said, which is we have this patchwork of energy policies right now, different renewable portfolio standards in many of the states, nothing in some states, different standards in other states. But I've always felt that giving people some kind of a goal for reduction is a good idea. The devil's always in the details. What would that standard look like? And as many of you probably know, last year we were actually able to pass the RPS through the House, and it narrowly failed in the Senate. So I guess I'd like to ask you whether you feel that a national renewable portfolio standard could be developed that would be part of the overall framework and that would be workable as helping to set goals.
I'd start, but then my colleagues, I would say that that's an area where you'll see different opinions on the panel. Some are in favor of it, some aren't in favor of it.
Well, let's hear from somebody who's not in favor of it.
I would raise a question about it that hasn't been resolved. For instance, we're in the wind business. We have over 500 megawatts under operation, 5,000 under development in Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, and because that's where the wind is. But we're not developing wind in North and South Carolina because there is no wind. We're not building it in southern Ohio or Kentucky or southern Indiana because there's no wind. If you look across the country and you put a wind map on the country, and then you put a solar map on the country, in which you see certain regions are very attractive for making investments in either wind or solar, but it's not uniform across the country.
Well, sure, and you're right about you are absolutely right about that. But on the other hand, those other states, nobody's going to do RPS that says you have to get a certain amount of your energy from wind or a certain amount of your energy from solar. And in truth, as someone who's worked on these issues for a long time, I'll tell you, every region of the country has some kind of renewable energy. The trick is to set the standard at a level that would be a workable level for everybody.
And I think you're absolutely right about that in terms of getting the right renewable level. But what I find that's been the most difficult, I talk to people who want wind because I'm in that business, but the same people that support ITC and supporting wind are also the same people that oppose eminent domain, so I can build a transmission line and get it to the customer. So until there's some consensus, it is unrealistic to hope for wind without passing eminent domain legislation.
I understand. Let's hear briefly from somebody who supports a national RPS standard.
Ms. DeGette, I happen to be one of those rare, maybe utility folks who does support a national standard, and frankly, the reason is I have seen in the West what happens when states create their own individual standards and they take the view that it's not renewable unless it's in my state. And that disadvantages renewables because it creates the least effective resources being built as opposed to the most effective. So we need to develop this system, and I 100% agree with Jim that along with this, we have got to address the issue of transmission access, and siting. And it just doesn't make sense for natural gas pipelines to be built under one set of rules and electric transmission lines be built under another set of rules where we cannot get this infrastructure that's necessary.
Yeah. I would just say that in Colorado, we passed, as most of you know, we passed an RPS several years ago as part of a voter initiative because all of the utilities opposed it. And within about 1 year, we had exceeded that standard. The legislature adopted a new standard that was a much more stringent standard that they worked with the utility companies to agree to. So I think this, I hear you, what you're saying about some of the eminent domain issues, but I think we could arrive at something, a fairly low threshold, and then build from that.
I don't want to leave you with the wrong impression. While I might not support a national renewable portfolio standard, I have supported a renewable portfolio standard that was approved in North Carolina, as well as one that was approved in Ohio. So I've actually, within the states, approved it because the local law was written in a way to reflect what the opportunities were for renewables there, rather than trying to have a national standard where one size fits all.
I think, though, you could take into account the regional differences. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gett. Next would be Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to go back to the consumer question for a minute because that's the one that could create the kind of political blowback that would make all of this just an academic exercise. So I assume you built some models along with these projections, and I was curious if you take the 2020 target, which was to get to 80% to 86% of 2005 levels. If you went forward over this next period and up to that year without the kind of buffering that you've suggested needs to happen, and I confess I don't quite understand how the buffering would work, but without it, you know, give me an average ratepayer and tell me what the percentage increase would be in their bill if you didn't have the accommodations in place, and then tell me what you think you could achieve if you did do the buffering that you mentioned.
We did a lot of modeling of the Lieberman-Warner bill and all the various aspects of it, and so I'm going to kind of recall a lot of those studies, but it won't be precise, but it will give you a zip code. Mm-hmm. If you go, and it depends really on the state. If you're in a state like Ohio where 86% is coal, versus a state like Indiana where it's 94% versus a state like South Carolina with 24, it produces different answers. And I think in Maryland, I think it's pretty close to 50% of the electricity comes from coal in Maryland. But under scenarios like that, you're looking at 20 and 40% increases in the price of electricity without any ability to mitigate cost. And that is why it became so critical in this blueprint that we had provisions in there that allowed for the mitigation of cost, because absent that, I agree with your observation that if we could pass legislation and if it translates into 20 to 40% increase in the price of electricity, the backlash to that could be devastating to our ability to address climate change long term. And that is why it is so critical and why this group came together around allowances and came together around the recognition that 40% of the allowances should go to the utility sector where 40% of the emissions come from, and that a significant portion of those should be used to mitigate cost increases during the transition period.
With the goal of getting them to what kind of level against the 20 to 40 that you've...
We didn't agree to the specifics of that, but we all recognized by using the words significant portion that we had to make sure it didn't translate into a draconian increase in prices during this interim period.
I mean, if I could just add one thing to that. This blueprint stands as a whole. Everything is linked. Our ability to meet the kinds of targets that we put here, which are quite aggressive, is based on having some allocation to the local distribution companies. It's based on the cost containment measures that we have in here, including the use of verified real offsets. So we sort of view this as a way, as a whole, to protect the environment and have a sustainable economy and not increase prices hugely to consumers.
Congressman, I would add just one other thing is that, you know, the way to think about what we've proposed, there's probably an 80 or 90% overlap with an energy policy and really taking control over technologies that are going to give us long-term control over energy costs. Our electricity bills did go up by 40% a year ago as the spike in oil and other natural resources took place. And I think when we execute on this plan, we're going to have over the long term a set of technologies that I believe are going to allow us to have more control over time and more security over time about how to think about energy technologies and productivity.
Did the projections of what the sort of unbuffered scenario would be account for what you hope the new technologies will produce in terms of efficiency, or they did not?
It did. We did take into account the availability of the technologies, how long it would take us to bring a nuclear unit on and shut down coal units so we would reduce our CO2 footprint, and what the cost implications would be. We looked at the prospect of bringing on carbon capture and sequestration with respect to existing facilities. We looked at energy efficiency and did scenarios on really aggressive energy efficiency and succeeding there. And we actually looked at different scenarios on renewables in terms of the cost implications as well as the availability on a 24/7 basis and that implication.
My time's up. I'd just say that all the more reason to be as aggressive on the energy technology as you're trying to be. I'm troubled that so much of that technology is being purchased overseas because I think we've lagged far behind. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sarbanes. Before I recognize other members for questioning, I know that a number of you have to leave, and I want to express my appreciation. I know you were going to leave at 12:30, and you've extended your time to be with us, and this has been very helpful. I've listened to your responses to the questions, very important and legitimate questions from the members, and I think it's been very helpful in clarifying the matter. You do represent a remarkably diverse panel, a cross-section of American industry and environmental advocates, and your call to us is to adopt comprehensive, environmentally protective, economically sustainable, and fair legislation to address global climate change. And the economic crisis, as I've heard you all say, is not a reason to not move forward, but is a real reason why we should move forward at this time. So I thank you so much for being here, and I appreciate all the work you've done as a panel in developing the proposals you've sent to us. I am looking forward to working with members of the Congress on our committee, both sides of the aisle, from various regions, with the various stakeholders, with the new president, with members of the House and the Senate in leadership positions on both sides of the aisle as well, and seeing if we can accomplish this goal this year. It's a very aggressive timetable. So I'm going to excuse those who have to leave, but I know we have others that will stay behind to answer further questions from the members of the committee. Thank you so much. In fact, it probably isn't a bad idea if any members any of the witnesses that are going to be testifying want to take a quick break, we can do that. Otherwise, we don't have. What's that? Yeah. Oh, okay. No, we have a whole new group that's coming in from the USCAP that are prepared to answer questions. They're not the CEOs, but they're people who have been very involved in the issues. We're going to pick up questions where we left off, but I want to introduce a new set of witnesses. We have Elizabeth Thompson, the Legislative Director of the Environmental Defense Fund, Betsy Moeller, Executive Vice President of Government and Environment Affairs for Exelon Corporation, Anne Renee Klee, Vice President for Corporate Environmental Programs for General Electric, Daniel Lashoff, Ph.D., the Director of the NRDC Climate Center for NRDC, Stephen B. Cornelli, Senior Vice President, Market and Climate Policy for NRG Energy, Janet Peace, Vice President for Markets and Business Strategy for the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, Steve Klein, Vice President of Corporate Environmental and Federal Affairs for PG&E Corporation, and Robert L. Bendick, Jr., Director of U.S. Government Relations for the Nature Conservancy. We're delighted that you're all here to further answer questions from members of the committee. As I indicated, it's going to be the practice of our committee that all witnesses testify under oath. So before you sit down and get too comfortable, I'd like to ask if you would stand and raise your right hand. Do each of you promise and swear and affirm that your testimony will be the truth and nothing but the truth? Record will indicate that each of the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Mr. Rogers, you would be next in asking questions. You wish to be recognized? No. Ms. Schakowsky was next. She's not in the room at the moment. Mr. Welch, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to a line of questioning that was asked by Mr. Markey. There's two things. One, this committee with the Chairman Waxman and Chairman Markey are intent on having a significant climate change bill by Memorial Day. It's very ambitious. Second, Mr. Rowe, an earlier witness, pointed out the obvious, and that is all of us have to make decisions that minimize risk. And there's a debate, and there will be an intense debate among members of this committee and in Congress as to what will be the economic consequences of the action that we take. But the question I have for each of you, and I just want to go down, is this, and I'd like to just get a yes or no answer, because this is really a threshold issue for us. Does doing nothing to address climate change, in other words, us getting unable to resolve the debate about the consequences of action, does doing nothing to address climate change, inaction, threaten our economy in your view, yes or no? And I'll start, is it Mr. Bendick?
Jonathan Pershing with the World Resources Institute. Yes, it does.
Okay. And Mr. Klein?
It does, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir, it does.
Okay.
Yes, it does.
Yes, it does.
Yes, sir.
Well,
there are buttons on the base of the mic, so be sure you press
them. Well, I want to thank everyone, because the threshold question is whether we have to act. And one of the debates we're going to have is whether the risk of acting is greater than the risk of not acting. And it's that elemental. And as you have heard from listening to the questions of the members of the committee, there's a division of opinion, less about whether global warming is a threat, but a very lively debate about whether action will be worse than inaction. And I find it very heartening that leaders of the advocacy community and the industrial and energy community are united on urging Congress to be a partner in acting. Let me ask it's Ms. Clay from General Electric. Mr. Immelt was here, and your company's pretty good size, as I understand it. What are the consequences of inaction economically, as you see it, to General Electric and the work that you do?
There's a base button on the base.
I think you heard the CEOs identify some of the risks this morning. There is the lack of investment that will be made because there's uncertainty as to where to put limited investment dollars. There's also the fundamental fact that there will be regulation. EPA will move forward. but it may not move forward in the most cost-effective way. So we may have a lost opportunity by not pursuing legislation. And there will be the additional costs that we believe will be incurred if we have to act more quickly later.
I see.
So those three things, I think, combine to make it a very costly decision one way or another.
All right. So if I understand what you're saying, it's not only important to act, it's important to act sooner rather than later.
That's our belief, and it's important to act smartly.
Okay. Well, you're asking a lot for that, but I'm glad you have. Hope springs eternal. Mr. Klein, how about you?
I think one of the things that we see is that both in terms of protecting our customers from the kind of increases that the first panel talked about in terms of their electricity rates, we also see an incredible lost opportunity if we don't act now.
That being?
That is that there's this amazing developing new technology centers across the United States, and we see those jobs going overseas and that technology superiority going overseas. And so in terms of our service territory, where Silicon Valley is, putting a lot of time and energy into these technologies, we're going to lose that if we don't act now.
Okay. Ms. Mueller, a lot of the critics who raise legitimate questions about cap and trade point to the experience in Europe that they cite as a failure. Your view on the European experience and how that should inform us about a cap and trade approach?
We do not have substantial operations in Europe or any significant ones at all. However, as a student of climate change, I think we have learned a lot of lessons from the European experience. We need a robust cap and trade system. We need to deal with cost containment, as we call it. We have, in the mechanics of our proposal on cost containment, we have applied some of the lessons learned from Europe. I would also say that ultimately we hope there will be a worldwide program, that it will not be just the United States and just the EUTS trading system. And so we need a program that is ultimately going to work on a multilateral basis. And we hope that by starting here, we'll get it developed.
All right, thank you. Ms. Pierce, could you comment
Well,
on
Mr.
that?
Welch, your time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Castor?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to thank Chairman Waxman and Chairman Markey for starting us off less than 1 week after the Congress has sworn in, starting us off on climate change. And thank you to the panel for your participation. Can you all chronicle the current research efforts in carbon sequestration, various research efforts that are showing some promise at all? Who is conducting that research? What is being done right now?
Congresswoman Castor, Mr. Chair, that's a great question, and we actually tend to think that there's several phases on the continuum from research to deployment that are involved with all of the promising technologies. With respect to carbon capture and sequestration, one of the exciting things is some of the technologies are very close to commercial deployment. You heard Mr. Nolan from Siemens earlier talk about part of the need was of this program is to get competition and market customers established for the major developers of the technology. And with coal gasification, the technology to actually scrub the carbon out, compress it, and
but who is conducting that research? It's been
well, that's not even research anymore. That's being done by private companies who are ready to do it.
What is that private company?
Well, private companies like GE, like Mitsubishi, like Siemens, like that we can get you more information.
Yeah,
later,
because there was a utility in my neck of the woods in Florida that was held up very early as the one of the prototypes for carbon sequestration, and they've abandoned their research project for many different reasons. So I'm trying to now
one of
get a
our
little more
views
detail on
is,
who's conducting the research.
One of our views as a coalition is that we need these complementary measures that were described earlier to jumpstart things like carbon capture and sequestration, because right now while the technology can be put together, it hasn't gone down the cost curves like Mr. Immelt said, it's not cheap enough or widely available enough to use everywhere, and we think creating more demand and more supply will help make those things happen quickly. So,
can anyone else shed some light on it?
I'm Bob Beinecke from the Nature Conservancy. My name tag is somewhere here. Of course, there is a great deal of very specific evidence on sequestration by trees and by other natural systems, and I think we know pretty precisely what different forest types sequester how quickly, both in the U.S. and outside the U.S., and that's why sort of forest carbon issues are part of the blueprint, because we know what those are. It's a very old technology, and one we can count on in very specific ways if the regulations surrounding keeping those trees in place are good ones, and that's what we advocate.
If I could just add, I mean, we are working with our customers and have a project with Duke in Indiana for an IGCC coal plant with carbon capture and storage and other facilities to be CCS ready, and our customers have been very receptive to that. And we also have a lot of experience, and other companies do as well, with CO2 injection as part of enhanced oil recovery. So the technologies are there. It's a question of getting them to be economically feasible. And the research for large-scale projects is very, very resource-intensive, cost-intensive, and that's why.
So it's mostly going on in the private sector, not at universities?
It's going on at both. But it is very cost-intensive, and that's why getting funding is important to ensure that we can take it to that next level.
I was just going to say, in terms of universities, there has been quite a bit of work. Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory has done work characterizing underground, the underground geology. Mr. Chu, who's nominated to be Energy Secretary, has been involved in overseeing that work. There's a lot of work at Stanford University and elsewhere in the academic community and in the Department of Energy National Labs, Battelle and other national labs as well as Berkeley.
There's also a great deal of collaborative research being done by the Electric Power Research Institute in our industry, and then Harvard has a major coal research project underway as well.
And do you go ahead?
I would just add that a lot of folks talk about CCS as being a new type of technology, and they've been using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery for 30 years in the Permian Basin. Granted, it's a little bit different if you want to sink it into a brine aquifer, and it requires, a lot larger cost because you're not getting the revenue back from the oil.
Thank you, Ms. Castor. Ms. Eshoo?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for making the very first hearing of in the 111th Congress of Energy and Commerce on this issue in your new chairmanship. I think that bodes very well for the country. And I want to compliment the USCAP team for the work that you've done. This has been a very interesting morning to listen to all of the testimony. Our colleague, Mr. Markey, has a saying, and that is that there's no place to take a sick planet to, no hospital to treat a sick planet. So I think that as we talk about the internals of a national policy of how we clean up and move on in a new way to not only protect our resources, but also to move on economically and everything that comes with it, that we will be making a contribution to the world community as well. I can't think of anything more important for all of us to be working on. I'm a member of the House Intelligence Committee, as well as this one. And back in, I think 2 years ago, there was a CNA report that was issued, and it was written by admirals and generals that found that global climate change posed a significant threat to America's national security. So this isn't only an issue covering the items that you all have spoken about this morning and members have asked questions about. This is an issue that does and will continue to have an impact on America's national security. And to that end, both myself and Mr. Markey, chairing the Select Committee on Global Climate Change, and myself as a subcommittee chair at the Intelligence Committee, held an open hearing, a public hearing last year on this very issue. Here are my questions. I'd like to know if any of you can tell us about where the gaps in R&D are as to the major research and development that needs to take place on these issues, and if you have any recommendations to us about what role specifically the federal government should play in these investments that won't overlap with what currently is taking place with private sector R&D, either being considered or underway. That's my first question. I've been here for a long time, so I'm going to get all my questions in first. I'd like to know how you're all measuring your successes. There are many successes that have been mentioned this morning, and I hope you had the benefit of hearing what your forebearers at the table spoke about. I'd like to know about that. And thirdly, given where we are in our country with what has happened in the private sector and the rip-offs that have taken place, I'd like some of you to comment on what recommendations you would have to us on how we don't end up in the traps of not having enough oversight. I know that Mr. Tersick, before he joined the Nature Conservancy, was with Goldman Sachs, and I think we still have someone from the Nature Conservancy here, whether you can address this or not. So I guess my question is, do you believe that oversight of the market is really an issue in this whole debate, and what Congress can and should do and address as it designs climate legislation? I think without effective oversight of the Congress, that most frankly, and it's not a pretty depiction of what goes on, is that there are companies and corporations, private sector people, that end up chewing their limbs off of their own corporate body in order to get a leg up, and it hurts everyone and everything. I don't think anyone wants to see a repeat of what we're experiencing now, and the huge toll, the damage that it's taken on our national economy, not to speak of individuals and families and communities. So those are my three questions, and I thank you for the work that you've done.
Well, the gentlelady's time is almost expired, but I do think it's fair to have her questions responded to, so I'd like to have her call any of the volunteers, any of you on the panel volunteer to answer some of those questions.
Well, I'll start with the response on the market oversight. I'm speaking for Environmental Defense Fund, who believes a lot in cap and trade. Market oversight is fundamental. That is part of what makes it work. Transparency, accountability. I think you've already heard those themes throughout the day. Now, the blueprint does not go into detail on that, in part because we did not have the experts on that. But I think that is a serious issue and one that we hope to work with Congress on.
We would support that entirely. I mean, we feel very strongly that transparency is key to the success of this program, and a strong oversight role is appropriate. I'd like to quickly address how we, from a company perspective, define success. And Mr. Immelt mentioned it this morning, but it's really our Eco-Imagination program. That's what's shown us that reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing energy efficiency is good from a business perspective. We save over $100 million a year through what we do internally as a company, and from a product perspective, we are increasing our revenues, and we set targets for that. We will hit $20 billion in revenues next year, and have a goal of hitting $25 billion by 2012. And those are technologies that increase energy efficiency and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So those are key measures of success for us.
On the, another measure of success I think that's important to us as a coalition as opposed to as individual companies would be measured in the things that you all measure and produce so well, and that's votes. We really are serious that we want to see this legislation pass as quickly as possible. We really want to work with you. We want to sort of provide a stimulus or a push to Congress, and we want to be pushed back by members on all sides so there can be an effective, good debate and a very good policy that will be good for our environmental colleagues, good for our corporate colleagues, good for the country, and that's how we will measure success as a coalition. In terms of the gaps, you know, of R&D, we do think there's a lot of a lot of technologies ready to go now that can step into the gap and that can go down that cost curve. We think there's a whole bunch of new ones that have not yet even really been invented yet, that with the right price signal and the right kind of R&D support, we can drastically lower the cost of powering our economy, building buildings, creating building materials and information management, food, fiber, without emitting carbon. And we would like to see the United States be the leader in that. That's fundamental research as well as strong assistance for continuous deployment of technologies.
We have very little time left, and we have two members who want to ask questions. As you think about the questions that Ms. Eshoo and other members have asked, we'd like to invite you to submit additional comments for the record. Mr. Rogers.
I know Mr. Ensley has a quick question, so if I could yield just a minute of my time to him, and then I'll take the remaining time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Just quickly, I want to ask about this issue of how the permits should be allocated for a cap-and-trade system. Europe had an experience where they gave them away instead of auctioning them. Instead of using a market-based system, they just gave them away. And they found it very suboptimal because it did not create a price on carbon. Citizens felt abused because an asset they own, which is the atmosphere, was just giving it away for free and simply reduced the effectiveness of the program. Many of us think that we ought to start with a mixture heavily weighted to an auction with perhaps some accommodation for energy-intensive industries to ameliorate some of these issues as a preferable way to do this. I'd appreciate any of your suggestions, particularly of those who sort of agree with me.
Again, Mr. Inslee, it's an excellent question. It's a very important and consequential decision that this committee and the Congress has to make about how the allocations are made. We do, I think, in the blueprint, take notice of the experience in Europe and make recommendations to avoid it in several ways. First of all, we do recommend following the approach that you've proposed with respect to energy-intensive industries. So that's one area where we believe a allocation is warranted as opposed to an auction. Also phasing out as those things are, as those competitive distortions are addressed. With respect to allocations for the electric industry, rather than give allocations primarily to generators, most of the allocations that we're proposing would go to regulated local distribution companies specifically on behalf of their customers, and we specifically talk about the need to avoid windfall profits as part of that. And finally, with respect to merchant generators, such as NRG, we do propose some allocations, but they're limited to the net compliance costs that those companies have. So again,
thank you, and I want to thank Mr. Rogers for his assistance.
Mr. Rogers.
Thank you. And time is short, so I'll be quick if I can. And from General Electric, are your company still in the appliance business? You build appliances? What percentage of those appliances by component is built outside of the United States?
You know, I don't have that information for you, but I can get it to you.
Yeah, it's pretty significant, though, isn't it? You've, over time, have moved quite a bit of the manufacturing, at least components.
We have significant manufacturing in the United States.
Sure, but you've also moved significant manufacturing outside of the United States?
We have yes. Manufacturing and partnerships and sourcing outside as well.
And did the federal government tell you that you needed to go into eco-imagination?
No, sir.
You did that on your own?
That was an entirely voluntary effort that Mr.
Great program. My point here being that, congratulations, I think the market is showing that you can do this on your own. And is it not true that General Electric would benefit significantly financially from their business model if we passed a cap-and-trade bill?
I think what Mr. Immelt said this morning is that our energy business is strong right now, and we will do well with it regardless.
Mm-hmm. He's also quoted as saying, and I quote, he has made it clear that he would be getting rid of, this is not a quote, made it clear that they would be getting rid of lower margin businesses. Manufacturing in today's day and age is a low margin business.
I did not see that quote, but I am quite certain that he was not referring to the energy business in the United States.
Mr. Rogers, will you yield to me just to point out to you that there's 2 minutes and 40 seconds left on the vote on the floor, and I'll let you go ahead and continue your questions.
Okay. I won't go on too much. My point being here, Mr. Chairman, is that I think climate change is incredibly important as well. But there are some great industries that are voluntarily getting into the economics of the environment, which is fantastic. We all win when that happens. And I think we need to be very careful about our witness panels who are basically saying they're going to, especially a company like General Electric, who has already skirted rules and regulations in the United States to make money overseas, perfectly legal. If we make it more difficult to manufacture things, and that's what we do in the state of Michigan, you are going to kill a state like Michigan. And it worries me a lot that there is maybe a better approach to this rather than this very complicated cap-and-trade system that has brought corruption to Europe. And I think you addressed that through your transparency question, which is great. But the reason that you don't have it in your blueprint is because nobody knows how to do it, that you don't run into these corruption problems. I just hope that we take our time, we do this right, if maybe not at all, or build in an incentive for businesses to adopt what General Electric has done and is excited about in their environmental sector of business. And if we don't do that, I think we are all certainly going to regret it. And from a state that still likes to build stuff in America and built the middle class in America that is slowly eroding away because we can't build things anymore, we better understand what that means for the average person who gets up and still builds things in this country. So I appreciate the opportunity, and the chairman was very gracious to let me go. And now I'm going to introduce a rule change package here in the House. But thank you very much. I appreciate your time.